23 years. That is how long I sat at that mahogany desk outside the corner office on the 42nd floor of Hartwell and Morrison Financial Group. 23 years of being the first to arrive at 6:45 in the morning, and often the last to leave after the cleaning crew had already emptied the trash cans. 23 years of knowing things that nobody else in that building could possibly know. Things that were never written down in any employee handbook, things that existed only in my memory and in the complex web of relationships I had built. One phone call, one handwritten thank you note, one perfectly timed coffee order at a time. My name is Patricia Connolly, and I was not just a secretary. I was the central nervous system of an organization that managed over $4 billion in client assets. I was the institutional memory that remembered when Mr. Morrison Sr., God rest his soul, had promised the Whitfield family that their quarterly reviews would always be scheduled on the third Tuesday of the month, because old Mrs. Whitfield had chemotherapy on Mondays and needed a day to recover. I was the human firewall that knew which board members despised each other and could never be seated at the same table during the annual gala. I was the emergency contact for 14 different vendors, the holder of 17 different passwords that executives had long forgotten they had created, and the only person in the entire company who knew that our biggest client, the Yamamoto Trust, required all correspondence to be printed on cream-colored paper with a specific weight of 32 pounds because Mr. Yamamoto's late wife hated that white paper felt cold and impersonal. I knew that the CEO, Richard Hartwell III, took his coffee with exactly 2 sugars and a splash of oat milk, but only after 10 in the morning, because his doctor had warned him about his blood sugar levels. I knew that the CFO was allergic to shellfish, and that this information needed to be communicated to every caterer, every restaurant, and every client who might possibly invite him to a business dinner. I knew that the head of compliance, Martha Chen, had a daughter with severe anxiety and that Martha needed to leave early every Wednesday for family therapy, a fact that was never put in writing but was silently accommodated, because I made sure her calendar was always blocked during those hours. I knew which clients were going through divorces, which ones had children in rehab, which ones needed a gentle touch, and which ones responded only to aggressive follow-up. I knew the birthdays of over 200 clients, their spouses' names, children's names, and in many cases their pets' names. I sent personalized cards for every single one of them, and I had been doing so for over 2 decades. The filing system I had created was a masterpiece of organizational engineering that had evolved over 23 years to accommodate the specific quirks and needs of every department. Color coding system alone had taken me 3 years to perfect. The red tabs indicated time-sensitive regulatory documents. The blue tabs were for client correspondence. Green tabs were for internal memos. But within those categories were subcategories that only I understood, subcategories that had developed organically in response to specific crises and specific requests and specific personalities. The physical files in the archive room on the 38th floor were organized not alphabetically, not chronologically, but by a hybrid system of my own design that accounted for frequency of access, regulatory importance, and client relationship status. I could retrieve any document from the past 20 years within 4 minutes. I had timed myself. And then Bradley Thornton arrived. Bradley Thornton was 31 years old. He had an MBA from a mid-tier business school that he mentioned in every conversation as though it were Harvard. He had spent 4 years at a management consulting firm where, as far as I could tell, primary job had been creating PowerPoint presentations with phrases like synergistic optimization and leveraging core competencies. He had been hired as the new chief operations officer because he was the nephew of a major investor, a fact that everyone knew but nobody was allowed to say out loud. He arrived in January with a Tesla, a Rolex, and a mandate to modernize operations and reduce overhead. The first time I met him, walked past my desk without making eye contact, snapped his fingers in my direction, and said, "Coffee. Black. And make it quick, I have a 9 o'clock." He did not introduce himself, did not ask my name. He did not notice the 23 years of service awards hanging on the wall behind my desk, or the photograph of me shaking hands with the company's founder at my 15-year anniversary dinner. He saw a woman in her late 50s sitting at a desk outside an executive office, and he made an assumption. That assumption would eventually cost the company more money than his annual salary multiplied by 10. Over the following weeks, Bradley began what he called his operational efficiency audit. He walked through departments with a tablet, asking questions about processes and headcounts. He scheduled meetings with department heads, and asked them to justify their budgets line by line. He used phrases like redundant workflows and legacy inefficiencies, with the confidence of a man who had learned business from textbooks and had never once been responsible for the actual execution of anything. In February, he called me into his office, the corner office that had belonged to Mr. Morrison Sr., the office where I had served tea to clients whose grandparents had been founding investors, the office where I had once held Morrison's hand while she cried after her husband's cancer diagnosis. Bradley had redecorated. The antique desk was gone, replaced with a minimalist glass table. The oil paintings of the company's founders were gone, replaced with abstract art that looked like someone had sneezed on a canvas. He was sitting in a chair that probably cost more than my monthly salary, and he did not ask me to sit down. He said that he had been reviewing the administrative budget, and that he had some concerns. He said that he had noticed I was making a salary that seemed disproportionate for an administrative support role. He used air quotes when he said the word support, as though the concept itself was somehow suspicious. He said that he had done some research and that similar positions at other firms paid 30% less. He said that the company was committed to competitive compensation, but that we also had a responsibility to shareholders to eliminate unnecessary expenses. I asked him, calmly, what he was proposing. He smiled the way people smile when they think they are about to deliver bad news to someone who has no power to fight back. He said that he was proposing a restructuring of the administrative support function. He said that he had identified a staffing agency that could provide temporary administrative assistance at a fraction of the cost. He said that many of my current responsibilities could be automated using a new scheduling software that he had seen demonstrated at a conference. He said that the company valued my years of service and that they were prepared to offer me a generous severance package. I asked him if he had discussed this proposal with Richard Hartwell, the CEO, the man whose coffee I had been preparing for 15 years, the man whose mother I had visited in the hospital every week during her final months, the man who had personally handed me a bonus check and told me that the company could not function without me. Bradley's smile flickered, just slightly, and he said that Richard was fully aligned with the modernization initiative and that this decision had been made at the executive level. I knew he was lying. I had been screening Richard's calls and managing his calendar for 15 years. I knew when Richard was aligned with something, and when Richard was being steamrolled by someone with louder opinions and shinier credentials. But I also knew something else. I knew that I was tired. I was tired of being dismissed. I was tired of being invisible. I was tired of being the person who held everything together while people like Bradley Thornton collected credit for work they did not do and could not understand. So I did something I had never done in 23 years of service. I said okay. Bradley looked surprised when I said it. He had clearly prepared himself for resistance, for tears, for begging. He had probably rehearsed a little speech about how this was not personal and how the business environment required difficult decisions. But I did not give him the satisfaction. I simply asked when my last day would be, and he said that 2 weeks would be sufficient for a transition period. I nodded and asked if there was anything else, and when he said no, I stood up and walked back to my desk with the same calm, measured steps I had taken for 23 years. During those 2 weeks, I did exactly what I was asked to do and nothing more. Bradley had arranged for a young woman from the temp agency to shadow me. Her name was Kaylee, and she was 24 years old, and she had worked as a receptionist at a dental office for 8 months before this assignment. She was perfectly nice. She was also completely, catastrophically unprepared for what she was walking into. On her first day, I showed her the phone system, which had 14 different lines and a complex routing protocol that I had developed with the IT department in 2015. She nodded and took notes on her phone. I showed her the filing system and explained the color coding, and her eyes glazed over after approximately 90 seconds. I showed her the master calendar, which existed in 3 different formats, because some executives preferred digital, some preferred paper, and Mr. Hartwell preferred both with handwritten annotations that I updated every evening. She asked me if there was a simpler way to do this, and I told her that this was the simpler way, that the previous system had been even more complicated before I streamlined it in 2019. Bradley had also purchased a subscription to something called SyncFlow Pro, which was an AI-powered scheduling and administrative automation platform. He had seen it demonstrated at a conference and had been very impressed by the sales presentation. He showed me the interface on his laptop and explained that this software would handle calendar management, meeting scheduling, email filtering, and even basic correspondence. Said that this was the future of administrative work, and that companies that failed to adapt would be left behind. I asked him if the software knew that Mr. Hartwell had a standing lunch with Sander Mitchell on the first Friday of every month, a lunch that was never put on the official calendar because the senator preferred discretion. Bradley stared at me blankly and said that all recurring appointments could be entered into the system. I asked him if the software knew that the Yamamoto Trust required cream-colored paper for all correspondence. He said that seemed like an unnecessary complication that should probably be eliminated anyway. I asked him if the software knew that Mata Chen needed to leave early on Wednesdays, or that the CFO was allergic to shellfish, or that board member Douglas Crawford had not spoken to board member Helen Ashworth since the 2018 merger dispute, and that seating them in eyesight of each other at any company function would result in immediate and public conflict. Told me that I was being resistant to change, and that these were exactly the kinds of legacy inefficiencies that modern systems were designed to eliminate. On my last day, I handed Kaylee a folder, the most critical information I could compile in 2 weeks. It was 73 pages long, and I knew she would never read it. I cleaned out my desk, which took longer than I expected because 23 years of accumulated memories do not fit easily into a single cardboard box. I walked past Bradley's office, and he gave me a wave without looking up from his laptop. I took the elevator down to the lobby, handed my security badge to the guard who had known me since his first day on the job 18 years ago, and walked out into the cold February afternoon. The first disaster happened on day 3. Richard Hartwell had a board meeting scheduled for 10 o'clock in the morning in the large conference room on the 42nd floor. I had always prepared for board meetings by arriving at 7, setting up the room with specific seating arrangements, placing water bottles at each seat with the labels facing outward, ensuring that the presentation technology was functioning, firming catering, and printing backup copies of all materials in case of technical failure. Kaylee did not know any of this because Bradley had told her that the scheduling software would send automated reminders, and that setup was the responsibility of the facilities team. The facilities team had never been responsible for board meeting setup. I had handled it personally because I knew that Douglas Crawford sat in the third chair from the left and Helen Ashworth sat at the opposite end of the table, and that reversing this arrangement would result in exactly the kind of confrontation that Bradley had dismissed as a legacy inefficiency. 9:55 in the morning, the board members began arriving to find an unprepared conference room. The presentation screen displayed an error message. There were no water bottles. There were no printed materials. The catering had not been confirmed because Kaylee did not know that board meeting catering required a separate confirmation call to the vendor's direct line, not the general order system. Douglas Crawford walked in and found himself seated directly across from Helen Ashworth, because Kaylee had placed name cards alphabetically. Within 10 minutes, Douglas and Helen were engaged in a heated argument about the 2018 merger that had absolutely nothing to do with the agenda. Richard Hartwell spent the first hour of his board meeting managing interpersonal conflict instead of discussing quarterly projections. I heard about this later from Martha Chen, who called me that evening to tell me had been, in her words, an absolute circus. The second disaster happened on day 5. The Yamamoto Trust, our largest client, received a routine quarterly statement. It was printed on standard white paper because Kaylee did not know about the cream-colored paper requirement, and even if she had known, she would not have known where to find the specific 32-pound weight stock that I had special ordered from a supplier in Connecticut for the past 15 years. Mr. Yamamoto's assistant called the office to inquire about the change in stationery. Kaylee, who did not know the history of the Yamamoto relationship, who did not know that this client represented over $400 million in managed assets, who did not know that Mr. Yamamoto's late wife had been the one to establish this preference, transferred the call to the general client services line. The call was answered by a junior associate who had been with the company for 6 months, and who told Mr. Yamamoto's assistant that the company had recently implemented operational efficiencies, and that stationery preferences could no longer be accommodated for individual clients. Mr. Yamamoto requested a meeting with Richard Hartwell. The third disaster happened on day 8. Senator Mitchell arrived at the restaurant where he had been meeting Richard Hartwell for a private monthly lunch for the past 7 years. Richard Hartwell was not there. Richard Hartwell was, at that moment, in a meeting that Kaylee had scheduled during the lunch hour, because she did not know about the standing appointment that was never entered into any official calendar. Senator Mitchell waited for 45 minutes before leaving. He did not return Richard's calls for 3 weeks. The fourth disaster happened on day 12. The annual compliance filing for the Securities and Exchange Commission was due at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. This filing required signatures from 7 different executives, supporting documentation from 4 different departments, and a specific cover letter that I had drafted and refined over the course of 12 years to ensure that it met every regulatory requirement, while also protecting the company from potential liability. Kaylee did not know that this filing existed. Bradley did not know that this filing existed. The SyncFlow Pro software had a reminder set for the due date, but the reminder went to an email address that Kaylee had not been monitoring, because she did not know that the previous administrative account had been forwarding certain messages to a separate compliance folder. 4:37 in the afternoon, Martha Chun discovered that the filing had not been prepared. At 4:52, she discovered that 2 of the required executives were traveling and had not signed the necessary documents. The filing was submitted 18 hours late, resulting in a penalty of $50,000 and a formal inquiry from the regulatory board that would take 7 months and over $200,000 in legal fees to resolve. The fifth disaster was not a single event but a slow, grinding collapse that unfolded over the following 3 weeks. Vendors stopped receiving payments on time because Kaylee did not know the payment schedule I had maintained for 23 years, a schedule that ensured our preferred vendors received checks on specific dates, that aligned with their own billing cycles and that guaranteed us priority service and discounted rates. The florist who provided arrangements for client meetings stopped delivering because an invoice had gone unpaid for 6 weeks. The caterer who had provided lunch for every executive meeting since 2009 informed us that we were no longer a priority client, because 3 consecutive orders had been canceled without proper notice. The IT support contractor who had maintained our legacy systems for the past decade submitted a formal complaint, because Bradley had questioned an invoice that I had always approved without discussion, because I knew that this contractor had saved over $100 in emergency repairs during the server failure of 2017. Client birthdays were missed. Anniversary acknowledgments were not sent. The handwritten notes that I had always prepared for Mr. Hartwell's signature, notes that clients had framed and displayed in their offices, because they appreciated the personal touch, stopped going out entirely because Kaylee did not know the system, and Bradley had decided that handwritten correspondence was an outdated practice that modern clients did not expect. The phone system became a nightmare. Calls were transferred to wrong extensions. Important clients were placed on hold and forgotten. One particularly disastrous morning, Bradley's nephew, who had been brought in to help with what Bradley called the administrative transition, accidentally disconnected a call from the president of a pension fund that represented 6% of the company's total managed assets. The pension fund president had been calling to discuss a potential expansion of the relationship. He did not call back. And through all of this, I sat at home, reading a novel I had never had time to finish, drinking tea in the middle of the afternoon, and waiting for the phone call I knew would eventually come. The call came on a Tuesday, exactly 6 weeks after my last day. It was not from Bradley, which did not surprise me. It was from Richard Hartwell himself, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice from the first syllable. He said my name like it was a prayer, like it was the answer to a question that had been keeping him awake at night. He said that he needed to see me, that he needed to talk to me in person, that he understood if I was angry but that he was asking, as someone who had known me for 15 years, for just 1 hour of my time. I told him I could meet him for coffee the following morning. He suggested the restaurant where he used to have his monthly lunches with Senator Mitchell. I almost smiled at the irony. When I arrived, Richard was already seated. He looked older than he had 6 weeks ago. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his suit, usually immaculate, was slightly wrinkled in a way that told me he had not been sleeping well. He stood when I approached the table, and he did something he had never done in 15 years of professional interaction. He hugged me. It was brief and awkward, but it was genuine, and when he pulled back, I could see that his eyes were wet. He told me everything. Told me about the board meeting disaster and the Crawford-Ashworth confrontation that had nearly resulted in 2 resignations. He told me about the Yamamoto Trust, which had formally notified the company of their intention to move their $400 million to a competing firm at the end of the quarter. He told me about Senator Mitchell, who had not returned calls in 3 weeks, and whose chief of staff had made it clear that the senator felt personally disrespected, told me about the SC filing and a regulatory inquiry and the $200,000 in legal fees. He told me about the vendors and the crackers and the cascade of small failures that had accumulated into something that felt, in his words, like watching a building collapse in slow motion. Told me that the company had lost in total approximately $9 million in client assets, regulatory penalties, legal fees, and emergency remediation costs. Told me that projections suggested they would lose another $40 million in client departures over the next 2 quarters if confidence was not restored. Told me that the board had held an emergency session and that Bradley Thornton had been asked to resign effective immediately. He told me that Bradley's uncle, the major investor, had been furious until he saw the financial reports, at which point his fury had redirected toward his nephew with a speed and intensity that Richard described as genuinely frightening. And then Richard Hartwell, the CEO of a $4 billion financial institution, the grandson of one of the company's founders, the man who had once told me that I was the most valuable employee in the building, asked me to come back. He offered me my old position with a 40% raise. He offered me a new title, Executive Administrative Director, with a seat at the quarterly operations meetings. He offered me a private office instead of a desk in the hallway. He offered me 3 weeks of vacation instead of 2, a dedicated parking spot in the executive garage, and a signing bonus that was more than I had made in my first 2 years of working for the company combined. He said that he would personally apologize to me in front of the entire executive team. He said that he would do whatever it took. I let him finish. I took a sip of my coffee. And then I told him no. The look on his face was something I will remember for the rest of my life. It was not anger. It was not frustration. It was fear. Genuine, undisguised fear at the realization that some things, once broken, cannot be repaired with money. I told him that I had appreciated my time at Hartwell and Morrison. I told him that I had given the company 23 years of my life and that those years had meant something to me. I told him that I had watched the company grow, that I had been there during the good times and the bad times, that I had considered many of my colleagues to be family, and then I told him that 3 weeks ago, I had accepted a position as Executive Administrative Director at Yamamoto Holdings, Mr. Yamamoto's family office, where I would be overseeing administrative operations for their entire North American investment portfolio at a salary that was nearly double what I had been making and with benefits that included a company apartment in Manhattan. I told him that Mr. Yamamoto had called me personally, 2 weeks after I left Hartwell and Morrison. He had been given my personal contact information by his assistant, who had obtained it from records I had maintained. He told me that his wife had always spoken highly of me, that she had mentioned me by name during their final conversations, that she had said the woman who sends the letters on the cream paper understands what it means to care about details. He told me that he was moving his assets not because of the white paper, although that had been symptomatic of a larger problem, but because a company that would dismiss someone of my caliber in favor of software and a temp worker was not a company he trusted with his family's legacy. He asked me if I would consider working for him directly. I told him I would think about it. And then I thought about 23 years of being invisible, of being dismissed, of being called just a secretary by a man who could not run a calendar without an app telling him what to do. I said yes. Richard sat in silence for a long moment. He asked me if there was anything he could say to change my mind. I told him that there was not. He asked me if I would at least consider consulting for the company during the transition, helping to repair some of the damage, rebuilding the systems I had created. I told him that my new position required my full attention, and that I was sure Kaylee would figure things out eventually. He winced at that, which I admit gave me a small, petty satisfaction that I am not entirely proud of but that I do not regret. As I stood to leave, Richard asked me one final question. He asked me if I had known, when I walked out the door 6 weeks ago, that this would happen. He asked me if I had seen this coming. I thought about the question for a moment. I thought about 23 years of institutional knowledge. I thought about the filing systems and the vendor relationships, and the client preferences, and the unwritten rules that existed only in my memory. I thought about Bradley Thornton and his MBA and his SyncFlow Pro software and his absolute certainty that anything I could do could be done cheaper and faster by someone, or something else. I told Richard that I had not planned for this to happen. I told him that I had simply stopped preventing it. He nodded slowly, and I could see that he understood. He finally understood what I'd been doing all those years. Not because I had told him, but because he had experienced, for 6 terrible weeks, what it felt like when I stopped. I walked out of that restaurant into a bright spring morning. My phone buzzed with a message from Mr. Yamamoto's office confirming my start date. Somewhere behind me, in a building I would never enter again, the phones were ringing, and there was no one left who knew how to answer them properly. And for the first time in 23 years, that was not my problem.